Testing 1 2 3. 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 Taking up the sword of Christian theology and the shield of classic apologetics, while taking Christian truth into the arena of ideas. This is the Bellator Christi Podcast, and we hope you're doing well today. We thank you for joining us on the podcast, and hope you're doing well. Still trying to get... Okay, all right. I think we're ready to go here. I've got, for the first time, as promised, I do have the podcast going live on YouTube at the same time that I'm recording it for the regular podcast. So if you want to go to youtube.com /Bellator Christi. Got my cat here trying to jump on things. Let me get him down. And that's the joy of live streaming. Well, all right. So anyhow, trying to get him down. Wasn't expecting that. So when you go live, especially on YouTube, there's no telling what you're going to find, what you're going to see. So anyhow, this is the Bellator Christi Podcast, where we take up the sword of Christian theology and the shield of classic apologetics while stepping into the arena of ideas. On today's podcast, we have a lot of stuff that we want to talk about, a lot of things that's been going on in society. I, by nature, am not a political person, but there are times where politics does enter into the world of theology. And so we're going to be talking about a couple of things going on that has happened this past week that we need to mention. Not really political, but it does enter into the genre of politics. I do want to mention that since this is being recorded live on the YouTube channel, I don't have a set time right now, but if people have a particular opinion about what time would work well for them, if they like the case of the podcast, you can shoot me a note at Brian Chilton, Chilton, at BellatorChristi.com, and I'll see what I can do. But right now, I am live streaming. It's on the YouTube channel. If you do have any questions and would like to interact with the content today, if you go over to the YouTube channel, you should be able to type in a comment there, a question there, and then I will deal with those questions live as the podcast goes on, but it would have to be during the live taping of the podcast in order to get your question on there. If you do have a question and you don't make the live feed, that's okay too. You can actually go to BellatorChristi.com, and while you're there, there is a link where you can submit a question to Bellator Christi, and I will try to either email you an answer if it's not something that where I could answer on the podcast, or your question may be the fodder, if you will, or maybe the topic of a future article or a future podcast. So go to BellatorChristi.com. Should be, I think, on the top right section of the screen, and you can click your question, and then I'll get to it, Lord willing, as soon as possible. So there's a lot of stuff I would like to talk about on today's podcast. First and foremost, there is an issue that took place this past week that's been in the news and on the minds of several different Christians, and that is the United Methodist Church delegates beginning last Saturday, met together as to ask the question as to whether or not they would accept LGBT marriage or LGBT clergy in the United Methodist Church. Now, it's important for us to set the backdrop on this, in that the United Methodist Church is a global denomination. It's not just found in the United States. It's also found in Africa, found in Asia, all over the world, in fact. South America is found there as well. So there was a big question mark this past weekend as to whether to move forward to accept LGBT individuals or should revise their church's doctrine and practice regarding these issues. The one article says they will consider several proposals, including one favored by some of the bishops called the One Church Plan, or at least they were, which would drastically redefine marriage to include same-sex unions and allow for LGBT clergy, in attempts to carve out exceptions for conservative clergy and laity that disagree with such a radical departure from church tradition. In other words, it seemed as if they took the One Church Plan, there would most likely be a departure of conservative churches from the denomination. The article goes on to say that on the first day of the conference, United Methodists heard a convictional and pointed address against the proposed liberal reforms by Dr. Jerry P. Kula, an African delegate who is a professor at the United Methodist University in Liberia. And you can read his remarks online if you'd like to do that. But one of the things that he said, one of the impressive things that he said, and which is really going to be the topic. I'm not really going to address the issue of LGBT. I'm not going to address the issue. Let me just say that one thing that we do need to remember, and I've said this many times before, we need to understand that we need to love everyone, okay? We're commanded to do as such. But that doesn't mean that we have to agree on everything. And that's something that I think, quite honestly, our culture has forgotten, that it's okay for us to disagree with one another on issues, but we can still love one another. That's something we need to remember. But Dr. Kula says in his address, he says, "Friends, please hear me." He says as much, that we are not afraid of our sisters and brothers who identify LGBT, questioning or what, so on and so forth. He says we love them and we hope the best for them, and we know of no compelling arguments for forsaking our church's understanding of Scripture and the teachings of the Church Universal. And then please hear me when I say, as graciously as I can, that we Africans are not children in need of Western enlightenment, because there was a comment that was made. I need to set a backdrop for this. There was a comment that was made by another individual during this time that the church needed to grow up. Okay, that's the way it was termed. So he says when it comes to there was Western Enlightenment, we do not hear a progressive U.S. bishop. We do not need to hear a progressive U.S. bishop lecture us about our need to grow up, and that's what was said. Let me assure you, we Africans, whether we have liked it or not, have had to engage in this debate for many years now. We stand with a global church, not a culturally liberal church elite in the U.S., emphasis added there. He says, with all due respect, a fixation on money seems more of an American problem than an African run one. We get by on far less than most Americans do. We know how to do it. I'm not so sure you do. So if anyone is so naive or condescending as to think we would sell our birthright in Jesus Christ for American dollars, then they simply do not know us. We are seriously joyful in following Jesus Christ and God's holy word to us in the Bible. And in truth, we think many people in the U.S. and in parts of Europe could learn a great deal from us. The UM churches, pastors and lay people who partner with us acknowledge as much. Please understand me when I say the vast majority of African United Methodists will never ever trade Jesus and the truth of the Bible for money. Now, again, I'm not even going to address the LGBT issue. I'm not going to address that on the podcast today. It's been addressed 100 times by other apologists and so on and so forth. One of the things I want to address as it pertains to this issue is I want to address the arrogance that, quite honestly, I believe was shown. I don't know all the details. I wasn't there, and I'm not going to accuse anyone of anything. But it does seem that we as Americans many times do have this ideology, or we do have this belief system that our culture is greater than other cultures. And I think many people would agree with that. No matter whether you're conservative or liberal, I'm sure about everybody who listens to my podcast is most likely a conservative. But I'm just saying that I think everyone would agree, whether they be conservative or liberal, would agree in the fact that we could learn a lot from the global church. I wonder, I've been hearing about our brothers and sisters in Asia and in parts of the world where the church is growing while they're being persecuted. Would that happen in the United States? I don't know. Because I kind of seriously doubt it, because we a lot of times have this, we talk about people growing up. I think we as American Christians are the ones who need to grow up, to be blunt. Because if we stub our toe or something doesn't go our way, the first thing we do is we cry and sob and we say, well, Jesus doesn't love us anymore. Do we not? I think if we're quite honest, I think that's what we do 9 times out of 10 as American Christians. So I think instead of the African church, instead of them needing to learn from us, I think we need to learn from the African church in this regard. Now, whether or not you agree with the African church's stand on this issue, that notwithstanding, the issue I'm addressing is the fact that we, many times as Americans, believe that our culture is superior to other cultures. And here we are in a situation where the African church is staking a claim in the Bible and saying we are not going to budge. One group was talking about finances, the other group was talking about the Bible and being true to Jesus. That is what I'm talking about today. The American church could learn a lot from the African church in 3 different ways. 1, the American church could learn from the African church's boldness. One thing, whether you agree with a brother in Christ from Africa, whether you agree with Dr. Kula or not, one thing you have to admit is that the man had boldness for Christ. The man had boldness, and he was not about to lower his Christian convictions for any type of political correctness. I think we are too politically correct in America, and it is suffocating us. We cannot have intellectual dialogue anymore because we are so worried about hurting a person's feelings. Now, that doesn't mean that we need to be brash and that we need to try to hurt people's feelings, because I've heard people say this, and then they'll say all manners of hateful things and use that as an excuse to do that. Or they'll try to bully people and they'll use that as an excuse to try to get their way. That's obviously not the case. I'm talking about intellectual dialogue. We don't know how to do that anymore, and that's part of the reason why we are in such the shape we are, where social media has become a firestorm. And quite honestly, there is a potential, I think, that quite honestly that we may see another civil war in our nation for all we know. I said that on the very first podcast when this was Redeeming Truth Radio, when I was on Blog Talk Radio. The very first podcast, I expressed my concern that if things didn't change, if we didn't know how to talk about issues and work through different issues and converse with one another, that we were heading towards another civil war. And I think that, quite honestly, my opinion in that regard has only strengthened as time has grown. We don't know how to have intellectual dialogue anymore without getting emotionally caught up in the issues and not being able to see past our own selves. And that is problematic. That is very problematic. So I think we can learn from the African church's boldness. I think, number two, the American church can learn from the African church's devotion. Their devotion was to Christ and not to political parties. Their devotion was to Christ and not to political correctness. Their devotion was to Christ and Christ alone. And that is something we need in the American church. We, quite frankly, have our emphases placed in several different things, and we are so busy anymore that we don't have time to take with Christ. We don't have time to take with God. And our relationship with God is suffering because of that very thing, that very issue. We need a greater devotion to Christ in the American church, and I think the devotion from Dr. Kula was clearly seen in his address. And thirdly, the American church could learn from the African church's focus. Notice it was very interesting and kind of troubling, really, that the issue of finances was brought up. And it was basically said, my understanding, and if I'm saying this wrong, someone email me, text me, whatever, let me know that I'm off base on this, but it appeared that it was said to the African church that you need our finances to be able to survive. The emphasis was placed more on money. And that's troubling. That's troubling, in my opinion. But he said that their emphasis was not going to be, their focus was not going to be placed on finances and worldliness. It was going to be placed on pleasing Christ. That was their devotion. That was their focus. And we, as Christians, as American Christians, could learn a lot from that. A lot of churches, it seemed like, from what I've read from Dr. Tom Rainer, that a lot of churches in America today don't even wish to make changes until things have gotten so bad that their finances begin to shrink. And when the money's not coming in anymore, that's when they decide to make decisions. But by that time, it's already too late in many cases. The problem with the American church is that we have placed too much emphasis on entertainment, on being entertained. We have placed too much emphasis on money, finances, trying to be seen by other people, trying to be seen as successful by other people, instead of placing our focus on serving Christ and serving Him with our gifts and abilities. God has called me to the PhD program. He may not call everyone to the PhD program, and that's fine. That doesn't make me better than someone else. That doesn't make someone else better than me because they don't have one. We have to live out our callings to Christ and do what God has called us to do as individuals. And if we could learn how to get along with one another, just to keep our focus on Christ, then we would really see some great things happening in today's church, I believe. But the reason we don't in many cases, the reason we don't in many places, is because we have placed too much emphasis on worldly things and not enough emphasis on Christ. And we cannot expect to grow spiritually, numerically, so on and so forth, unless we put that focus on Christ. And numbers is another issue. I think we put too much emphasis on numbers. Yeah, I really do. Sometimes I think smaller communities might actually be better. To be honest, because people can get to know one another and they can grow with one another in that sense. So yeah, I think sometimes we do place too much emphasis on numbers, and I think that's one of the things that the millennial generation has right. That they're not as intrigued by these things as many older generations are. They want legitimacy, they want authenticity, and that should be the case for all of us, quite frankly. So, yeah, we could learn a lot from the global church. We could definitely learn a lot. Well, we're going to take a little brief break, and then we'll return here in just a few moments and talk about another issue taking place that's really quite frightening, in my opinion. I'll address a conversation I had with some folks on this issue, and an article I wrote that was published in a newsletter in Indiana. That and a lot more coming up on the Bellator Christi Podcast. All right, we're back on the Bellator Christi Podcast. This is Brian Chilton. We thank you for joining us. I do have one more thing to discuss before we close out today's podcast. And again, we want to thank you for joining us on the podcast today. I don't think I mentioned it from the outset because our cat jumped on the table and was trying to get him off, and I think, quite honestly, I forgot after that. But the Bellator Christi Podcast is a production of BellatorChristi.com. We do want to encourage you to go to BellatorChristi.com, and if you haven't already, be sure to click subscribe, and by doing so, you'll be able to get all the articles and links to the podcast as they become available. Again, I am now trying to, I won't be able to do the interviews in this regard. I won't be able to, whenever I interview someone, I won't be able to do the live feed through YouTube, at least right now. But there's maybe some technology you may know about that will help me to be able to get that done. But as far as right now, as it goes right now, I won't be able to. Whenever I do interviews, I won't be able to have that on the live feed. But as I'm doing these conversational pieces, I will be able to live stream those on YouTube. And this will give you a chance to interact. You will have to catch the live show. And if there is interest in that, I will obviously, try to pick a time that works for most people to join with the podcast. Kind of testing it right now. But again, I want to thank over 80 people who subscribed. I had about 20 people when I first started the YouTube account. It was 80 people in less than, 2 or 3 months. It was around 2 or 3 months' time. I was able to get over the 100 mark threshold to be able to change the live feed to, or the URL, to Bellator Christi, YouTube.com/Bellator Christi. So you can go there and you can catch the podcast. If you missed the podcast, or missed the live stream, you can still catch the video. And of course, you can listen to the podcast on several different means. You can go to iTunes, TuneIn, Stitcher, as well as Google Play, and there'll be some extra things there with the audio version there available for you as well. So I want to close the podcast out by talking about another issue that is quite concerning for me in many ways. Again, I'm not a very political person, but I am very strongly pro-life, and that's something I have been for many years. If you've listened to the podcast, you know my stand on this, and this really bothers me that there are individuals and states that are changing the rules, even for abortion, to now allow abortions to take place up to the point that the child is to be born. I mean, this has really gone way in left field now as to the this is a fully formed baby. Okay. I know the argument's talking about whenever the conception happens, some people see the individuals being just a lump of matter or, molecules or whatever. That obviously, but now we're talking about a fully formed baby. Okay, so the line of demarcation has now shifted to allow abortions to take place on the day that the baby is due. This is a fully formed baby. And so I wrote an article back on February 5th. This has been shared in a newsletter in Indiana. It was a cover article for a newsletter in Indiana, and I'm very appreciative of the individuals who shared that. But I talk about 3 different ways in this article that theology, a person's theology, impacts their view on this issue. If you don't believe in God, then there's no purpose to life. Okay, it's like I was talking with a lady the other day. She's talking about teaching through the book of Ecclesiastes, and I told her, that the focus of Ecclesiastes is on the last section, because if you read the book without having the last section in mind, then man, you'll need a Prozac by the time you reach chapter 5. because everything is meaningless. And what I think Solomon's doing in that case, or the author's doing in that case, is he's showing that a life without God, very well ahead of his time, a life without God does not have any purpose or does not have meaning whatsoever. If there is no God, then there is no purpose. Then it doesn't matter if you commit if you have abortion or do whatever. If God doesn't exist, then nothing matters. And if God doesn't exist, and if you're an atheist, then you really actually have no ground for calling anything morally good or evil. Because nothing is good, nothing is evil. They're all, you may as well be a Buddhist. Everything's an illusion. There's also purposeless in the theology of ethics. I mean, again, there's no right and wrong in a world where there's no God. And then there's also the purposeless in the theology of God. This whole idea that it's my body, my decision, illustrates an inherent desire to be the sole master and commander of one's body and of one's destination. And one of the things that people don't want to do, a lot of times, and I guess this is just human nature, you can call it human nature, I think it's sin, quite frankly. I think it's part of our sin nature, that we don't want anybody being in control of us. We certainly don't want to think that God might be in control of us. So this is a problem. So what you think, so again, it says, John Stonestreet said this past week in a conference, ideas have consequences, bad ideas have victims. And he eloquently said this past week, and he's absolutely right, that normally the victims of bad ideas are children. Children are usually the ones who suffer when bad ideas and bad decisions are made. Children are suffering in this issue because you're talking about killing a baby at the moment of its birth. Children suffer in this whole sexual revolution because they no longer have their parents, which studies, after you can be angry with me if you want to, but studies have shown quite substantially that children do best in a home where they have both their mother and father. Dads are needed. That's not a popular thing to be said now, but it's true. It's not about popularity. There again, we need to go back to the African church's stand, because they were standing upon truth and not on political discourse. Again, going back to what we said earlier, I think we can learn a lot from the African church in this regard, with their bold stand. Whether or not you agree with them or not, their bold stand is quite impressive. So how we view God makes a difference. Belief in God will also do three things. A belief in God places value on each individual's life. If God exists, people have value. That means you have value, I have value. It doesn't matter if I'm pasty white, as you can see in the camera. It doesn't matter if I would be dark. It wouldn't be matter if I'm brown or yellow or whatever. Which I've never seen a yellow person unless they had jaundice or something. I don't know where that red and yellow, black and white. I've never seen a yellow person, outside of someone who has problems with their liver. But anyhow, that's just one of those things that we do. Sorry, my mind goes in some strange direction sometimes. Anyhow, but yeah, no matter what skin tone we have, our life has value. Our life has value. A belief in God places a value on a person's purpose, realizing that that God has a purpose for each and every person He's created. Now, that person may not live up to their purpose, to their God-given purpose, but that doesn't change the fact that God has given each person a purpose. And belief in God is actually the foundation by which we know that a person has inalienable rights. In a godless society, no one has rights, no one really has value, no one has a purpose. How can you say that everyone has rights if there's no right and wrong, if there's no moral legislation, no higher power holding us all accountable? You can say, well, society dictates laws. Well, yeah, Nazi Germany dictated laws. Stalin's Russia dictated laws. There's Pol Pot's regime dictated laws, but that doesn't mean that they're morally right. Belief in God is the foundation by which we know that each and every person has rights, and even that young child in the womb of its mother has and should have rights. And I tell you, folks, something that greatly concerns me. I had a conversation with a couple of folks this past week. I won't mention their names because I didn't ask permission to mention their names, and so I won't. And so I had a conversation with a few folks, and I told them, and this was wholeheartedly the truth. It concerns me because if we have devalued life at the front end of a person's life to the point that we're willing to allow a person to have an abortion on the very day of the child's birth, what's to say that in the future that won't happen at the end of a person's life? And I think that's already begun. At what point are we going to see people say, well, once you reach a certain age, we're not going to give you health care anymore. Once you reach a certain stage in your life, you're no better than a fetus, so we're just going to cast you off. See, there is a great concern I have, not only with the abortion issue, but how we view human life. And in a godless society, in a godless culture, human beings tend to lose rights because their value has been lessened. The Judeo-Christian worldview is not only true because it's historically true. It is the basis, it provides the sturdiest foundation by which cultures can build a society with the value that they place on each and every human being. In an atheistic society, it doesn't work. And that's why you see all these grave injustices. I know you can go back and say, well, this certain culture, this Christian culture did this, or this Christian culture did that. I know we all have flaws and we all have mistakes we've made. I get that. But at the same time, the Judeo-Christian worldview is the basis that provides individuals purpose, value, and rights. And once you take away God from the equation and you take away the value that God has placed upon individuals, then anything goes. And I fear for our nation. I fear for the American church more now than I have probably ever in my 15 plus years of ministry. So I would just say to you, friends, we need to pray for our nation. We need to pray for our churches. We need to pray for the American church. We need to pray for the global church, that God would strengthen us, He would give us the boldness we need to be the Christians that we need to have a strong relationship with Him, and to look for His return, because I believe He's coming sooner now than ever before. Each day that passes is one day closer to His return. But even still, I hear many people say, how much longer can God let this go on? I don't know. We'll see. It may be that there's still many more years left on planet Earth, but we don't know. Anyhow, long story short, you need God to have purpose. Belief in God grants us that purpose. It truly does. And because of that, Christians need to stand against abortion. I really believe this, especially these late-term abortions. I'm against abortion completely, but especially these late-term abortions. This is really very startling to me. It's very startling and very concerning as to the ramifications of where this type of thinking might lead. Well, anyhow, this is Brian Chilton. You've been listening to the Bellator Christi Podcast. We'll see you back next time. Thank you so much for listening, and please be sure to visit BellatorChristi.com. We'll see you back the next time that we step into the arena of ideas.